Thank you, Chair, and thanks to everybody for coming into us today and I think helping us understand the intersectional issues of disability and gender and finance. And it's actually difficult to know where to start with all of the issues that you've raised. There's so many, and I think it's actually so relevant, on International Women's Week or International Women's Day. Even when I was speaking about it in the Dáil this week, I was saying the tokenism of it, like speaking about it on this one day is great and it raises awareness and we really need that, but it's the other 364 days of the year that make a difference. And speaking about, for example, women's issues over here and disability issues over here and then everything else the rest of the year, it just isn't going to make a difference to the actual day-to-day lives of people. And I think that's where the real problem is. It can feel like lip service on those kind of tokenistic days. And you spoke about, in terms of intersectionality, one of the things that was touched on quite a lot was the cost of disability and social welfare. And one of the things that transpired recently was that of the applications for disability that were refused, the ones that were when people reapplied, over 50% of them were granted. So it just shows a really obviously over-restrictive approach from the Department of Social Protection. You're basically saying you have to apply, be rejected, and then reapply for the most part, and then you get it. And that plays out in so many areas of disability. It transpired on the Disability Matters Committee last week that it's the same when schools apply for SNAs. When they're turned down, 50% of those that reapply get them. So this is something that plays out throughout. There's so many issues that I'd love to ask you to elaborate on, even things you touched on the family courts there, with disabled women having their children, access to transport, issues around diagnosis. Basically, I think there is no understanding in terms of this government of what a rights-based approach is. That's the conclusion that I've come to. There is no understanding of how we can take that approach. That's not happening in Ireland at all. And one of the things that I always come back to in these sittings, and I think it's important to keep saying it, even though I sound like a broken record, is that we need to ratify the optional protocol, the UN Convention, because then people actually have a legal entitlement to rights, because it's very clear from my perspective that the government isn't going to just allow people to exercise their rights. They need to be held accountable. Unfortunately, that just seems like the only way we can do it. And, other countries have ratified the optional protocol. It's a disgrace that Ireland hasn't. We're the last one not to, the slowest to even ratify the UN Convention. And I just always think we need to make that point over and over again, ratify the optional protocol. And the Assisted Decision-Making Capacity Act is something that was used constantly as what I see as an excuse to not ratify. And we're coming to a point where that can't be used anymore. But I think, there's so many of those issues. What I want to do is ask questions specifically around disability, gender and finance that I think could help inform the committee going forward. So perhaps this question, maybe I'll direct it to Amy, because you just discussed a bit around the Assisted Decision-Making Act. But in terms of its potential impact on financial independence, just to get like a kind of very clear answer, in its current form, will it enable greater independence? Or do you have concerns about elements of it and how, just specifically get one on that? And then the Central Bank of Ireland is revising its code of practice aimed at ensuring that, because I'm going to say vulnerable people, and I think Nem and Paula have really highlighted that it's people who are made vulnerable by society can gain access to mainstream financial services in light of the Assisted Decision-Making Act. So has the Central Bank engaged with you as part of this process? And what consultations should they be conducting with people and organisations? And then finally, the capacity of individuals with disabilities to access credit has been identified as an issue, and credit unions are an important source of credit given their kind of inclusive culture and the accessibility of them in communities, and particularly that's in rural communities. But current limits on loans are just so restrictive. So I'm wondering if anyone would like to comment on that and the type of credit facilities that disabled people need, because I know the credit union is more accessible in general, even taking geographical spreads and stuff, but because of the rules that they have to abide by, like other organisations, unlike other organisations, they can't give, for example, loans for housing at the moment, and that's something that they're really keen to be able to do. I'll leave it there for now. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I have Amy, Paula, Nim, I think in that order that you put up your hand. So, Amy.
Okay, there's a lot there. So I'm just going to kind of go through it point by point. First up, kind of in relation to cost of disability and the fact that an awful lot of disability allowance applications are rejected first time. I don't find that surprising. The disability allowance system is a very complex and convoluted one, and getting the appropriate documentation together and getting it together in the right amount of time and that entire process is incredibly difficult and incredibly stressful. And that's for people, whether or not you require reasonable accommodations. It's also important to know that it continues to be a stressful system even once you have successfully applied for it and you have you're within the system, because any earnings that you have to take, you have to report back to disability allowance and you have to re-engage with that system consistently. And that is an incredible cognitive load, time load, administrative load. And it's very stressful and it's very complex and it's not entirely clear what documentation you're to send where. So I don't find it surprising that so many applications fail the first time and they're accepted the second time. I am also one of those people. So that's the first thing. So I don't find that surprising. Secondly, in relation to kind of the cost of disability and the gendered aspect to it, obviously we've heard a lot about how disability can be quite costly, and I don't think I need to restate that, but also bear in mind that the cost of living have a gendered aspect too, right? There are certain things that gender minorities have to buy that other people don't have to buy. In terms of, deciding where we live and how close we live to public transport, these are all considerations that gender minorities have to take into account when they're deciding where to live that perhaps maybe men don't, right? And that's a fact of how things are. It shouldn't be, but it is. So there's a gendered aspect there too. Then on to the bigger thing of the assisted decision making and whether it's going to enable financial independence. The answer is that so the assisted decision making system is an improvement over wardship, but it will ensure that disabled people have more financial independence if it is interpreted and if it is amended in a human rights compliant manner. And we have concerns around that because as the system is currently designed and laid out, there is more of a focus on providing people with supports in order to make financial decisions if we take that specific context. But there is still within it the provision that people's capacity can be tested, and that can create a system where people can be very, very vulnerable. So it really depends on how we move forward from this point, and we would have concerns based on what we've seen as to whether that is going to happen. It's probably something that requires a bigger conversation, and we'd happily continue with you over that over email if you'd be willing to, because it's a big issue. And then in terms of how we make the financial services rights-based and accessible to people, we need to look at it in a holistic sense, right? So currently within the financial system, there's a huge emphasis on vulnerability, and there's huge kind of swaths of people that are categorized as vulnerable for really kind of very medicalized and somewhat arbitrary reasons. And that is a huge issue, right? There's very little, if you look at the central bank codes of practice and documents of this nature, there's very little on supportive mechanisms. There's very little information on reasonable accommodations. In fact, if you're a person who needs reasonable accommodations, you will automatically be classed as vulnerable, and that's just not appropriate. And Nen spoke about how vulnerability is not an inherent characteristic of any individual. In terms of whether there's any consultation in relation to these kind of codes of practice, we are not aware of any with disabled persons organisations, not to our knowledge. So in terms of how we make that rights-based, we need to look at how we can introduce reasonable accommodations and support mechanisms, and how we can train the people who are working within the financial services to be supportive and helpful to disabled people and to enable us to make financial decisions and to interact with kind of the entire financial system.
So the next speaker is Paula.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Amy. And just to echo what you've said, and I suppose for me, being in different spaces with many disabled people, just on the financial services aspect of it, even things like a person with a visual impairment, for example, that there aren't that many accessible ATMs around the country, even less so if you're in a rural area. But even in Dublin, for example, I've been in a space with two people that have a visual impairment, and they're in different areas of the country, but they have said that it's an issue because the accessible ATM that they will be able to use is actually indoors, which is an issue because it's not accessible to them at all times, every day of the week. So that is an issue in and of itself. So we really need to look at how to make every ATM accessible to everybody, because, for example, if a blind person or a person with a visual impairment needed to get money out of their ATM, say at 8 o'clock on a Sunday evening, why should they have to give their bank card to somebody else? Because then that person needs to then know their PIN number, for example. So that can kind of raise issues as well, that they kind of have barriers that other people don't have. So it's even little things like that that would kind of take away their financial independence. And I suppose linked with all of this is, the personal assistance aspect. And I suppose I just really kind of want to emphasise that independence isn't about doing everything yourself. For Independent Living Movement Ireland, and I know that Disabled Women of Ireland would echo this, independent living is about you as a disabled person having the choice to live your life the way that you choose and the way that you see fit for yourself, whatever that looks like for you. And obviously being mindful of your impairment and how your impairment or condition affects your life, but it's about making you being allowed to, you having those choices yourself to live your life as you wish. And I think as well, many disabled people, unless you're actually involved in the disability rights movement or you're involved in a disabled person's organisation, you don't actually know, many disabled people don't actually know what a personal assistance is. They don't know the difference between a carer and a personal assistant. Just to emphasise, a personal assistant is not a carer. It's actually a situation where the disabled person is the employer and their personal assistant is actually employed by them. So it's not that the personal assistant is caring for the disabled person, but the disabled person actually delegates out tasks so that, say for example, if they wanted to go and do the grocery shop or go out to the pub, that they're basically just able to live their daily lives how they want it, that they don't need to wait for a carer to come in and get them up out of bed in the morning and put them to bed at night, that they're not restricted, that they have the options and the choices to live their lives how they wish. And I suppose for me as well, and particularly this is a bigger issue in rural areas, is the issue of accessible taxis and transport. As Nicola had said earlier, transport is a massive pillar of the independent living movement. It's a huge issue, and it feeds into the social isolation as well of disabled women, that a lot of them, they can't leave their houses when they want to, and that would have been especially an issue during throughout the COVID-19 pandemic, which we're still going through at the moment. But, if you're not able to get out and socialise or see your friends or go out about your day, that you have to kind of book this taxi that you often have to give 24 hours notice for. And I know in the area of Dundalk, I believe there's only 2 accessible taxis in the whole of Dundalk, which is a huge issue. So I really do think that does need to change. And even I've heard from other disabled people in spaces that wheelchair taxis have actually they've kind of been used for other things, like for school runs and things like that, but they're not being specifically used for what they're actually meant to be used for, or where a disabled person will book the wheelchair taxi and it will actually be cancelled at the last minute. And going into the cost of disability as well, is that they're actually a lot more expensive than your standard taxi. And that is a huge issue, because if a disabled person is on disability allowance alone and they say, need an accessible taxi, say, twice out of the week, well, then that's going to seriously eat into their disability allowance. And it's going to mean that, unfortunately, a lot of disabled people are actually trapped in poverty. So we really need to look at I suppose going back to the rights-based approach, it's really engaging more with disabled persons organisations,